So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Chris Jackson, Senior Vice President with Ipsos's political polling team. Chris, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you, Ellen. Greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our way too early inside track looking towards the next election, the 2024 election. But before we get to that, we have a lot of good, interesting data that we want to share with you. So Sarah, our senior data journalist, is going to run through a lot of those issues, and then I'll take on sort of the election stuff, the way too early look at the 2024 field. But just before we go into a little bit of a deeper dive on some of those issues, I just want to sort of show that issue landscape to you just to sort of set it all up. Here we are, February 2023, and really it remains the economy. The economy remains the main issue, the thing that most Americans, the plurality of Americans, are pointing to as their number one concern, the most important problem. And this has really been true for a while now. It's been true for over a year that the economy has been what people have been looking to really since sort of COVID started to slide off of the agenda in 2021. The economy has been that dominant issue, but the economy even is actually coming down slightly. It's not necessarily as dominant as it was a few months ago. I think as some of the things we've seen with inflation have eased a little bit, and Sarah will go into that in a little bit greater depth. After the economy, we see crime and corruption as that next top issue, and this is sort of pushing two things together. There's crime, which sort of everybody cares about to an extent, but also corruption, which is particularly right now for Republicans a blade to use against Joe Biden, particularly with his son Hunter Biden. And we're likely to see a lot more on that in the next few months. And then a number of issues that are sort of in this third tier: immigration, the environment, healthcare, inequality. Lots of stuff that's sort of competing for people's headspace. So that's the issue landscape. It's the economy, crime, a bunch of other stuff. Now I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to actually walk us through some of the data we have about what's going on in the economy. Sarah?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, as Chris mentioned, we'll be walking through the issue landscape, and we're starting first with the economy since that's the biggest worry on people's minds. And this first slide, since the last time we talked, you'll notice that people are still feeling pretty lukewarm about the economy and their place in it. Looking at that bold navy blue line, we're tracking here consumer confidence, Ipsos's consumer confidence index from 2002 to present day. And if we zero in on the past year or so, we see that consumer confidence has remained remarkably stable. And comparing this moment, this inflationary moment, to other moments of economic pain, particularly the Great Recession, we see that the economy, when it comes to consumer confidence and how people feel about their place in the economy, jobs really matter. As during the Great Recession, as unemployment spiked, consumer confidence tanked. Whereas during this inflationary moment, the consumer price index peaked at historic highs, generational highs, but it's only softened consumer confidence. It didn't bring it down. It did not tank it in the same way that we saw during the Great Recession. And that's mainly because jobs have really held over the course of this period. Which is all to say that persistently and historically high inflation is certainly not good. People don't like it, but it's not as bad as high unemployment. And in this next slide, we're going to really look under the hood at some of the questions that make up the consumer confidence tracker and understand how this dynamic between job security and comfort-making household purchases plays out and lands us in this middling position in the economy right now. So as we mentioned on the last slide, consumer sentiment is strongly linked to employment. Having a job makes people feel more confident in the economy, and people are feeling fairly comfortable with their job security right now. That number has come down somewhat since this time last year, but very few Americans are feeling comfortable making other household purchases, and that comprises things like groceries, toiletries, things of that nature, and that's represented by that teal line on the chart. And looking at that number, we see it's roughly in the same place it was in March 2020, when unemployment was skyrocketing and everything was shutting down and there were lots of shortages and lots of uncertainty that consumers were moving through. And as inflation picked up, that has landed that comfort-making other household purchases numbers back in that low 30s territory, whereas the unemployment number, that security with people's jobs, has picked up and remained much higher than it was in March 2020. And that really is the difference here in January 2023 between where we were way back when in March 2020 everything felt very uncertain and consumers were really feeling pinched by a lot of the shutdowns and things we were experiencing then. So that's all to say that those two opposing forces, job security and comfort-making household purchases, are landing us in this middling position, with jobs kind of buoying consumer confidence overall. And to just zero in on jobs for a second here, there have been a lot of headlines about layoffs across, particularly the tech sector. And we just want to take a moment to kind of contextualize some of those headlines. Here we're looking at Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers, and we're looking at unemployment rates by sector between January 2022 and January 2023, so the latest available numbers when we were putting this all together. And we can see that right now the unemployment rate for each industry is right around where it was at this point last year, if not a little bit better. So, some of the headlines we're seeing about layoffs, that's certainly happening in some sectors of the economy, but it's not expanding out, it's not rippling out to affect the wider economy right now. And the situation on the ground is looking a little bit better than some of the headlines may lead people to believe. And I would also say that just part of the softening we're seeing in the consumer confidence tracker on the jobs front is people reacting to those headlines in the news, and doesn't fully reflect, what they're experiencing in their day-to-day life for most people. And again, take-home point, really important thing to remember with consumer confidence, job security and unemployment numbers are really what's buoying consumer confidence right now. And changes on that front really have the potential to sway how Americans feel about the economy overall. So moving on to some of the other issues on Americans' minds right now, we're starting off first with abortion. About a month ago, it was the 6-month anniversary of the Dobbs decision and what would have been the 50th anniversary of Roe v. Wade. And in light of that, we ran some really interesting polling with NPR, trying to understand how Americans hold these two landmark cases on abortion in their minds together. And what we found is that majorities of Americans agree that the original 1973 Roe v. Wade decision was correct, which legalized abortion at the federal level. And looking at partisanship, we see, it's one of the single biggest drivers of opinion today, and we see huge differences in attitudes here. Majorities of Democrats and independents agree that Roe v. Wade was correct in the decision it came to, while majorities of Republicans feel that the Dobbs decision that came down in June 2022 was the right one. So, abortion is a really polarizing issue for the country, particularly the Supreme Court cases surrounding abortion is very polarizing. But there is one point of bipartisan agreement at this stage. Among majorities of Democrats, Republicans, and independents, majorities support using ballot measures or a voter referendum to decide abortion rights at the state level. And what that really tells me is that, while the Supreme Court and the decisions around abortion that institution has handed down has really polarized the country and has certainly become a rallying cry for partisans on both sides of the aisle, people are still open to using the democratic process for abortion rights and figuring out what that looks like at the state level. Spinning ahead to our next issue, Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. Tomorrow marks the first anniversary of Russia invading Ukraine. President Biden was in Ukraine earlier this week. And we've been tracking this conflict and attitudes around it really since it began last year. And what we found looking at our time series is that, most Americans, by and large, continue to support the efforts in Ukraine. That comes with some caveats. While that's true, at the same time, most Americans don't want to see the U.S. get involved in military conflict there, but do support things like taking in Ukrainian refugees. Many are following news about the war and support applying sanctions to Russia. So attitudes around the conflict have been pretty stable for the past year or so. They've softened a little bit, but overall, roughly where they were. And as the war continues on and we see this rhetoric intensify from both the US and Russia, we're going to keep tracking opinion just to see how things on the ground change, if at all. So moving on to our third topic here, climate. It's increasingly been a worry for Americans over the past decade or so. And back in December, we ran a really interesting poll with the New York Times exploring whether people can accurately identify which of their personal behaviors can best curb greenhouse gas emissions. And the New York Times did this great quiz where you can test your own knowledge. So, it was published in the middle of December. You all should definitely check it out. It was a really fun time. But to give you a bit of a cheat sheet before you take the quiz, I'll walk through some of the things we found. So on this slide, we're looking at the percent of people who could accurately correctly identify which actions people can take that reduce greenhouse gas emissions by the appropriate amount. So for example, very few people were able to accurately identify that doing things like living car-free, using renewable electricity, avoiding long flights have the largest impact on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Whereas, Americans by and large had a somewhat better time, still not a great time, identifying some of the actions that have a small impact. And if you look at the small, moderate, and large impact scale, Americans overall had trouble identifying the actions that had the greatest impact on curbing greenhouse gas emissions. And that's all to say that, while concern about the climate has climbed over the past decade and is now kind of in this tertiary main issue scape, as Chris mentioned at the top, very few people have a really solid understanding of what to do with that concern. There's not a really solid understanding of which of their actions is most effective at curbing greenhouse gas emissions, which is a really fascinating thing to take away and just explore moving forward. And that brings us to our last few slides. Here we're looking at partisanship and infighting in Congress, because it would not be an Inside Track webinar unless we spend some time talking about that. And this first slide, it feels like a million years ago at this point since we last talked, but the 118th Congress kicked off and had a bit of a bumpy start at the beginning of January. It took over a dozen votes, 15 rounds of voting for the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, to secure his speakership, which, a lot of pundits foretold more gridlock to come just based on that performance right from the get-go. And immediately following the speaker fight, we went to USA Today and wanted to explore with them how Americans were making sense of all the infighting they saw on their TV screens at the beginning of January. And what we found is that most Americans expect that gridlock to continue in Washington for the next 2 years. Majorities of Americans feel that Republicans and President Biden are not going to get anything done over the next 2 years. Majorities also feel that it's unlikely for Republicans and Democrats to compromise over the next 2 years. And, looking ahead at some of the questions and issues Congress will be facing in the immediate future, there's some real potential consequences and serious reverberations that could happen if that gridlock continues as Americans anticipate it will. So directly following the speaker fight in early January, in mid-January, Janet Yellen, Secretary of the Treasury, notified Congress that the U.S. hit its debt ceiling and extraordinary accounting measures were being taken to keep the government up and running. Best estimates at this point suggest that the extraordinary accounting measures will be running out sometime later this spring and early summer, which means that Congress has to or should arrive at some type of decision about raising the debt ceiling. And if they don't, there's some consequences that could happen from that. For example, the U.S. defaulting on its debt. And when we ask Americans about their concern about that, what some of those consequences, we see that decisive majorities of Americans are concerned about the consequences of recession, runaway inflation, and financial harm to them and their families should the U.S. government default on its debt. And while, majorities of Americans are very concerned about this, most people aren't really following news about raising the debt ceiling just about yet. And as we get closer to the heat of the debt ceiling fight later this year, we'll keep tracking whether the public starts paying more attention to this issue and whether lawmakers become responsive to public opinion here. But before we get that far ahead, I'm going to get back to Chris, who's going to walk us through what you need to know about 2024 so far.
Thank you, Sarah. So there's a lot of issues right now, a lot of things going on. We have a lot of data on it, and you're welcome to peruse all of this. It's available on the ipsos.com website. All of the data we're sharing with you is publicly available, so you're certainly welcome to use it, to reshare it, to cite it, whatever. But yeah, we have a large collection of really interesting stuff. So let's look ahead a little bit. Get way too early for the next presidential election. Well, I want to start off with sort of providing a little bit more of this sort of context, this sort of weather, and that is President Biden's approval rating. This presidential election that's coming up, if Biden runs, which he's still indicating he plans to, will really be governed by how the public views his presidency. Re-election campaigns are really first a referendum on how the public thinks the president has done, and then a choice about the alternative. And what we're seeing right now is that Biden's approval rating remains relatively soft. It's at 41% in our most recent core political release, which was about 2 weeks ago. But that is a bit of an improvement from where he was last fall, when his approval rating was regularly in sort of the mid to upper 30s. So it's up on a little bit of an upward trend, but certainly not good in any way, shape, or form. However, an approval rating in sort of the low 40s still gives Biden probably a better than even chance of winning re-election, maybe sort of 60-40 type odds based on where he is right now. And if we do continue to see sort of inflation easing, the economy continues to sort of muddle through without going into recession, we could actually potentially see Biden's approval ratings come up a little bit more, though I would not expect to see his numbers get past 45 or so, absent any sort of major events, just due to the sort of the partisanship that exists in America today. But just to provide a little bit of context about Biden's numbers, which again are a little bit weak, he's actually still doing better than any other major political leader right now. So these are the approval numbers for every major congressional leader and Joe Biden. We have Republican Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, the longtime Republican leader, at 15% approve. Republican Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy, the one who had to go through the aforementioned 15 votes to get the gavelship, at 21%. The new House Democratic Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries at 25%, and the Democratic senator from New York, Chuck Schumer, the majority leader, at 28%. So we can see, even though Biden's numbers are not great, everyone else is worse. So I think this really speaks to how much Americans don't really love their political leadership right now. Though for some of them, like Jeffries, for instance, it's actually as much a factor of the not knowing who he is. You can actually see his net score is basically tied. His disapproval and his approval is about the same. So that is an interesting, a little bit of an interesting phenomenon. But overall, most of these people are relatively negative. The other thing to sort of keep in mind as we look towards the election is how the public views the parties on a number of issues, particularly the issues that are leading sort of the debate. And like we discussed earlier, the economy is the number one issue right now. And we do see that the American public giving Republicans a bit of an advantage on that issue. You can see that on the far right of the screen. Republicans are still seen as a little bit stronger, so that suggests that on sort of the fundamentals of the election, Republicans are a little bit advantaged. However, on virtually all other issues, we see Democratic advantage, and that's going to be a little bit of what we saw, for instance, in the last midterm, where Democrats are really trying to talk about all the other issues that exist, whereas Republicans are trying to talk about the economy, unless, of course, they're a MAGA Republican, in which case they're talking about the election being stolen, which contributed to their losses in the 2022 midterms. So that's really the landscape we're looking at, right? Is Republicans doing better on the economy, Democrats doing better on most other issues, and which one is the main issue as we go into the election and to the 2024 elections will have a huge impact on what happens there. And just as another indication of where the Americans' priorities are, when we ask them specifically what Biden should focus on, it's the economy. Just like we saw the economy is the number one concern, when asked what Biden should be doing, it's the economy. And half of Americans basically saying that that is one of their top issues. After that, it's a range of other issues, immigration, which is primarily Republicans who are concerned about that, unifying the country, corruption, environment, employment and jobs, inequality, taxation, COVID. You can see COVID way down the list. That's certainly different than when Biden won the presidency in 2020, when COVID was the #1 issue. So that's sort of the shifting issue landscape that we're seeing right now. And then speaking to some of those issues, where's the American public writ large? And it's sort of interesting. So it's a bit of a grab bag on issues like guns or police reform. We do see sort of the public broadly in favor of things like, moderate gun control or in favor of moderate police reform. But if you change the wording a little bit, you see relatively significant differences. We don't have it on the slide, but for instance, if you were to ask about defunding the police, for instance, a large majority of Americans who are opposed to that, even while we see a majority, 58%, supporting the idea of removing qualified immunity for police. So again, there's a little bit of nuance and a little bit of gray area there. As Sarah mentioned earlier, the American public continues to support providing weapons and financial aid to the Ukraine in the conflict with Russia, even while Americans are not necessarily in favor of sending American troops. And then on the debt ceiling, and this is again an issue where there's actually a little bit of sort of murky fuzziness, and I think that's because Americans aren't necessarily following the ins and outs terribly closely, as Sarah showed earlier. Most Americans actually oppose raising the debt ceiling when asked as just a straight up question. This comes even while a large majority, 98%, are concerned about defaults and a recession that would be caused by a default and things like that. So, Americans on one hand are like, oh no, America should have a balanced budget. Well, on the other, they're like, I want to have all the stuff that the government's spending on, and I don't want there to be a debt ceiling, us to go off the debt cliff and have a recession triggered by that. So again, the American public a little incoherent on some of these issues. One issue that they're not relatively incoherent on, though, is protecting Social Security and Medicare, the sort of the long-term entitlement programs for older Americans. It remains the third rail of American politics. It's why we've seen Joe Biden out there talking about the Republicans wanting to end Medicare and Social Security, because a few of them actually did introduce programs to maybe cut it. And that, is a very unpopular idea. So Biden is using that as a cudgel against the Republican Party. This next slide is from that USA Today survey that Sarah mentioned earlier that we fielded after the speaker fight. And we asked people about how they view the two parties to get a little bit of a more impressionistic view of this landscape. And we asked Republicans and Democrats to say which party most closely fits these various descriptors, right? So, Democrats, of course, are going to say that the Democratic Party shares their values. Republicans are going to say the Republican Party shares their value. But it's the places where there's a little bit of differences that become really interesting. So, for instance, on the economy, that second line, we see Republicans are much more optimistic about that than Democrats are. And I think that speaks to the Democratic weakness on the economy right now, why that's a little bit of a Republican advantage of an issue. But on the other hand, you see that Democrats actually are a little bit better on issues that are a bit more sort of, let's call them feeling based. So cares about people like me, willing to compromise, inclusive. Democrats see the Democratic Party as much better on that than Republicans see the Republican Party. And then finally, the last thing I just want to call your attention to is the fourth from the bottom is effective in pushing their agenda. We see that among Republicans, it's actually split. Republicans, if they think Republicans or Democrats are more effective at doing that, where Democrats generally think that the Democratic Party is a little bit more effective. And I think that speaks to the continuing interest within the Republican base for sort of this outsidery type candidate, like what Donald Trump was in 2020, what Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor, is trying to portray himself as now, because Republicans don't really think that their national leadership, McCarthy, McConnell, are as effective, are good at getting their job done. I'd argue that that's maybe not accurate, considering how often they've actually been out of power, and yet they've been able to push through a majority in the Supreme Court and a number of other issues. But that's certainly the impression, the feeling that exists within that Republican base. So turning to the actual 2024 election, and this is the primary election. This is the Democratic and Republican on either side of the slide primaries, the race now. Right now, Joe Biden is suggesting that he's going to run. Donald Trump has already announced that he's going to run. But we did test this both with and without those two leading candidates, just to have a little bit of a sense of what might happen if Biden were to decide not to run, for instance, or Trump were to, maybe get indicted, go to jail. And what do we see? Well, we see that the two, the former president and the president are certainly the front runners in their respective parties. Though for Biden, it's not quite as dominant a position. At 35% of the Democratic voters registered voters saying that they'd support him versus 43% for Trump. However, there's not really a clear alternative to Biden amongst the Democratic base, right? So Democrats are maybe a little tepid about him running, but they also don't really have someone better in mind yet. So we see Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, all low teens, even down to the single digits as the alternative. And that's different than the Republican Party, where there is a clear alternative in Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who's currently seeing 31% when Trump is included. So is running a relatively close second, especially considering his name recognition is not nearly as robust as Trump's is right now. Now, if you take out the front runners, though, it gets to be a really interesting picture. So on the Republican side, it's relatively simple. It's DeSantis. DeSantis is a clear front runner if Trump is not in the race, has a 30-point advantage over the next closest person, former Vice President Mike Pence. On the Democratic side, it's a bit messier. Vice President Kamala Harris is sort of the de facto front runner with 27% if Biden's not in the race. But that's not a huge advantage over Senator Bernie Sanders, Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg, or even California Governor Gavin Newsom, who has said he's not going to run, but who knows if that's true or not. So the Democratic field, if Biden were not to run, is a bit messier. I would expect that primary to actually be much more competitive versus the Republican side, that if Trump decides not to run, I think DeSantis is a clear and relatively dominant front runner, at least this early out. And then the last thing I want to show in this section is just that, despite the fact that Democrats are a little bit pessimistic about Biden, aren't necessarily excited about Biden's candidacy, he does probably give them the best chance. And this is based on, we've shared this with you in the past, but this is based on a model we've built of elections around the world where we look at if the candidates are the current incumbent and what their approval rating is. And what we found is that incumbents have a much easier time winning, even at lower approval ratings versus a successor candidate. So a successor candidate would be someone of the same party that's not the incumbent. So think someone like Al Gore in 2000, who was running after Bill Clinton. Think Hillary Clinton in 2016 running after Barack Obama, or John McCain running in 2008 after George W. Bush. Those sort of successor candidates have a harder time winning, even at the lower approval rating. So, right now where Biden's approval rating is at 41, 42%, he's got about a 60-40 odds based on this model. So essentially a president with that level of approval wins 6 times out of 10. However, a successor candidate at that level of approval only wins 2 times out of 10. It's a much worse, much harder hill to climb for the successor. So, even though Democrats are a little bit like meh about Biden, they might want to still sort of come together and coalesce around him if he were to run, if the goal is to win the election. And then finally, I just want to introduce one little piece of data that we released yesterday, actually, and this is the second part of a survey we did. We actually released the first part earlier this month on sports fandom and sports betting in the United States. I encourage you to go to the Ipsos website and check it out. It's a really interesting, rich data set, lots of really interesting stuff in there. But the one slide I wanted to show you is this one about fandom. And what we can see is that most Americans consider themselves some sort of fan of sports. 2/3, 68%, say that they're a fan of something. And football is the most popular sport in America, remains the most popular sport in America, but it's not necessarily dominant, right? It's only 44% of Americans who say that they're a fan of the NFL, baseball, sort of America's pastime, 31% NCAA college football, just behind that 29, professional basketball and college basketball basically tied at about a quarter of Americans saying that they're fans of those. So, a real sort of mix of things, but there's not necessarily one sport that dominates America, even while most Americans do say that they're a fan of something, some sort of sport. And then the last we have in there, pickleball, it's fast growing, supposedly fast growing, though we don't have trend data on it yet. 4% of Americans say that they're a fan of pickleball. A little bit more, close to 10% say that they played it in the last year. But we plan to revisit this survey every year, so we will be able to sort of track it moving forward. And then the other piece is, I don't know about you, but like on the TV I watch, I see ads for sports betting on your smartphone all the time, but it looks like only about 8% of Americans have done so, at least as of this survey that was fielded in January, had placed a sort of an official bet, either in person or online or using an app. And that population was disproportionately male, a little bit younger, more affluent, sort of the kind of people that you would imagine. So, it's a big industry. It's a lot of money being spent in sports gambling, but it still represents a pretty small slice of America, even though that these fans are actually, they're kind of super fans, right? Like this 8% are much more likely to say they're fans of all sorts of different sports. They're more likely to say that they're watching games. So there is a connection between the gambling and the more intense levels of fandom. All right, so if you have any questions, like Ellen said at the top, please don't hesitate to punch them into the little Q&A box. Sarah and I will go through and answer any questions we get in the 15 or so minutes we have left. And also, please make sure to check out our website where we have all of this poll data. This deck and this recording of this webinar will also be posted there in the next day or so. And again, this is all public information, public data. You're welcome to use it. You're welcome to share it, cite it, what have you. We certainly encourage that. So let's see, what questions do we have? All right, I got to pull up the Q&A thingy here. All right, first question. I think I'll take this one. So does this suggest that the Republican race is going to be a cleaner race for Trump if he decides to run? It's pretty early in the primary process, right? The first primary won't happen for a year from now. And while early polling does have a pretty decent relationship with who ultimately wins, the fact that Trump's advantage over DeSantis is not quite so large does suggest that there's a little bit of weakness. I do think that if DeSantis were to get into the race, which he's indicated, but he hasn't actually announced, I think that will probably end up being a relatively hard fought campaign. And I don't think that Trump necessarily is going to be able to win it easily. That being said, if you've ever watched Ron DeSantis, he doesn't have sort of the charisma that Donald Trump does. He doesn't have sort of the command of how the media works that Trump has. So I would worry a little bit about a one-on-one debate between DeSantis and Trump that it'll be pretty factually challenged, but I think Trump stylistically is probably a little bit stronger on that, even though Trump carries a lot of baggage, right? Like he has presided over, 2 midterms where the Republicans underperformed in 2018 and 2020. He didn't preside over, but he was sort of linked to the underperformance in 2022. And, there's a lot of Republicans who are sort of a little bit tired of his shtick, even while he remains the most popular figure in the Republican Party. By a pretty decent margin. So yeah, I think it would be a relatively hard fought race. I don't though think that there's a real lane for some sort of never Trumper or anti-MAGA style candidate to run that isn't where sort of the Republican base is right now. I've seen some sort of talk about someone like Liz Cheney, for instance, who is a very conservative, traditional Republican, but, famous in relatively recent history for standing up to Trump on the January 6th committee, and then, getting sort of pushed out of Congress by, the more rabid MAGA sort of Republican base. And we did actually ask a survey question of a three-way race with Biden, Trump, and Cheney. And if that were to happen, Cheney would actually pull support from Biden more than she would for Donald Trump. Because again, I think the Republican base is much more unified around sort of that, that sort of candidate. Next question, which I actually just started teasing a little bit. Do you have any polling on the general election head-to-heads, and how reliable is the data at this point? So in the same survey, and you can check it out on our website that had the primary data I showed you, we do ask about 4 different general election scenarios: Trump versus Biden, Biden versus DeSantis, and then Biden versus, or no, Trump versus Buttigieg, I think, or was it DeSantis versus Buttigieg? I think it was DeSantis versus Buttigieg, and then Trump, Biden, Liz Cheney. And what we see is that all of the races are pretty close. Trump has a small advantage, 3 or 4 points over Biden in that head-to-head matchup. Biden has a 1 or 2 point advantage over DeSantis in that head-to-head matchup. I think that the one that was sort of the 2 independent people is basically a tie. And then Trump has a slightly larger advantage in that 3-way matchup with Liz Cheney pulling some of the support from Biden. It's more like a 8 or 10 point advantage for Trump. But I think all of that suggests that it's very close. I wouldn't necessarily say that the 4-point lead versus the 1-point lead is indicative of, it's going to be 4 points if this runs, or 1 point other. I think it's indicative that it's close. It's a very divided electorate. I wouldn't read into early polls this early too precisely. I think they're much more impressionistic, and the impression they give is that it is a closely divided country. Yes, there's probably some impact based on who ends up running. Biden has lukewarm support with Democrats. Trump has a very rabid base with Republicans, but then virtually everyone else is sort of meh about him. And I think that sort of is what the picture it's painting is. I wouldn't necessarily say that, if this poll has Trump up 3 and this one has Biden up 1, I wouldn't necessarily think that means anything at this point. I think it's too early for that, for these kind of polls to be able to show that level of precision. The topic of democracy was not taken in account in the survey. Why? So we actually did a lot on democracy just after the midterm elections. And I invite you to go to our website and check it out. We didn't include it in this webinar, I think mostly because it just kind of slipped my mind at the moment, and I apologize for that. But yeah, I think it is a big topic. I think that sort of protecting democracy was one of the issues that helped Democrats overperform in the midterm elections. We saw that the real sort of MAGA-y, that the candidates, the Republican candidates who were the election was stolen, were the ones who tended to underperform relative to sort of more traditional Republicans. And I'd like to use the example of Georgia. The Georgia incumbent governor, is sort of a more traditional conservative Republican, but relatively, again, famously sort of stood up to Trump in the 2020 election, cruised to his reelection. At the same time, in the Georgia Senate, Herschel Walker, the former Georgia football star, ended up actually losing in the runoff to incumbent Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock. So you have in a single election, 2 candidates on the same side, and the sort of traditional Republican outperformed the MAGA Republican because Walker was very closely allied to Trump by about 10 percentage points. And that's what we saw across the country. And indeed, several experts like Nate Cohn from the Times suggested that there was about a 7 or 8 percentage point drag for being a MAGA Republican in that election cycle. So yeah, I think it's an important topic. It's certainly one that that we've done a bunch on. Just, we hadn't done anything in the last month or two, so it sort of slipped our mind for this.
I would say we have that great white paper analysis we did on democracy and kind of authoritarian populism across the world. It's our System is Broken index. And late in January, we released a great white paper that's looking at, some of these populist and authoritarian tendencies around the world, and kind of puts some of these U.S. storylines in the global context. And we actually found that countries that have had elections see a lessening of this feeling that the system is broken, this tendency towards authoritarian type rulers, leaders, kind of political tendencies there. So definitely check it out. Feel free to message us if you'd like to see a closer look at that.
Yeah, no, great point, Sarah. And that's really interesting. It comes from our Global Advisor survey. So it's actually data from 27, 28 countries, something like that, around the world. So really interesting. I think the last question that we have time for, and I do want to mention that we have our next Inside Track webinar in 2 months on April 20th. So, stay tuned for that. We'll do the invite, send that around soon. But it's a off year, so we'll be doing these every 2 months instead of every month. But the last question is, will abortion continue to be a top tier issue like it was in the 2022 elections, one that helped, really decide the election, a lot of these close things? That's a great question. It's not one we can answer quite yet. I think, Sarah, do you have a perspective on how much abortion is going to matter in the next year and a half?
Yeah, it's an interesting question given how 2022 played out in some really key races and states. We'll have to kind of wait and see how different candidates utilize that as an issue. I mean, I think that's part of what's at play here is how political candidates bring it to be a top of mind issue for the public. Right now, it's kind of in the secondary position, but for the right people in the right places, if it's used effectively as a campaign tool, it's clearly showed that in 2022 it could be very effective at turning people out, and we'll have to see how that continues, or if it does, in 2024 and beyond.
Yep, so stay tuned, join us for the next Inside Track. We'll probably have some data to be able to speak to that more. But until then, thank you for joining us. Thank you for the time today. We really appreciate it. Again, all of this data is available on the website. This presentation will be available on the website in the next day or so. If you do have any questions in the meantime, please don't hesitate to contact Sarah or I. We always love to talk about this stuff. So thank you very much. Have a great day, and we'll talk soon.